March 6, 1944. 28,000 feet over Berlin. First Lieutenant Charlie Brown felt his B-17 Flying Fortress shudder as the third burst of flak tore through his aircraft's right wing, severing fuel lines and shredding control cables. Black smoke poured from his No. 3 engine as fragments from the explosive shell punctured his oil cooler and hydraulic system. Through his headset, he could hear his tail gunners screaming that German fighters were closing from behind. But Brown's immediate concern was keeping his crippled bomber airborne long enough to reach friendly territory. What happened next would challenge every assumption about aerial warfare, enemy behavior, and human nature that had governed combat operations since the beginning of World War II. As Brown struggled to maintain control of his disintegrating aircraft, a lone German Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighter pulled alongside his bomber. Instead of delivering the killing blow that doctrine demanded, the German pilot did something that shocked Brown's crew and would eventually shock his entire squadron when they learned the details of this extraordinary encounter. The German fighter pilot was Franz Stiegler, a Luftwaffe ace with 27 confirmed victories, who had been ordered to shoot down any Allied bomber within range of his aircraft. But as Stiegler looked across the narrow gap between his fighter and Brown's B-17, he saw something that made him question everything he had been taught about warfare, duty, and honor. The American bomber was so badly damaged that attacking it would be tantamount to murder rather than combat. This moment represented one of the most remarkable displays of chivalry and humanity in the history of aerial warfare. Stiegler's decision to spare Brown's aircraft and escort it safely out of German airspace would become a legend that transcended national boundaries and transformed how combatants viewed their enemies during the most destructive conflict in human history. But the story of how a German fighter pilot risked his own life to save his enemies doesn't begin with acts of mercy. It begins with devastating losses, mechanical failures, and a bomber crew that had volunteered for one of the most dangerous missions in the European theater of operations. To understand why Stiegler's actions represented such an extraordinary departure from military doctrine, you must first understand what American bomber crews faced when they flew deep into German territory, and why survival often depended more on luck than skill or courage. In March 1944, when the 8th Air Force launched its largest daylight bombing raid against Berlin, American bomber crews knew they were flying into the most heavily defended airspace in the world. The German capital was protected by over 400 anti-aircraft guns, multiple fighter squadrons, and early warning radar systems that could track Allied formations from hundreds of miles away. Flying a bombing mission to Berlin was considered tantamount to suicide. The B-17 Flying Fortress bombers that carried out these missions were technological marvels designed to survive the kind of punishment that would destroy any other aircraft. Their 4 Wright R1-820 Cyclone engines could maintain flight even when severely damaged. Multiple machine gun positions provided defensive firepower against fighter attacks. Most importantly, their rugged construction allowed them to absorb tremendous battle damage and still bring their crews home. But no aircraft could withstand the concentrated defensive fire that German forces brought to bear against Allied bombing formations. Berlin's flak guns could fill entire sections of sky with explosive shells programmed to detonate at specific altitudes. Fighter squadrons positioned throughout northern Germany could intercept bomber formations at multiple points during their missions. Most critically, the sheer distance from Allied bases meant that escort fighters had limited fuel for combat over the target area. American bomber doctrine emphasized tight formations that concentrated defensive firepower while reducing the effectiveness of fighter attacks. Bombers flew in combat boxes containing 18 to 24 aircraft arranged to provide mutual support through overlapping fields of fire. The formations were designed to protect individual aircraft while maintaining bombing accuracy through coordinated release patterns. Charles Leighton Brown was born October 24, 1922, in Weston, West Virginia. The son of a coal miner who had worked the dangerous underground seams throughout Appalachia, Brown grew up understanding that some jobs required men to risk their lives for purposes larger than individual survival. His childhood was spent in a community where courage, loyalty, and personal responsibility were considered essential masculine virtues. Brown's fascination with aviation began during high school, when he witnessed a demonstration by Army Air Corps pilots recruiting volunteers for the expanding military aviation program. The combination of mechanical complexity and individual skill required for bomber operations appealed to his practical nature and sense of adventure. Unlike many young men who sought glory in fighter aircraft, Brown was drawn to the teamwork and precision required for heavy bomber missions. After graduating from high school in 1940, Brown worked in his father's mine while saving money for college. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 changed his plans dramatically. Like millions of young Americans, Brown felt compelled to serve his country during its greatest crisis. He enlisted in the Army Air Forces in February 1942, requesting assignment to bomber pilot training. Primary flight training at Maxwell Field in Alabama revealed Brown's natural aptitude for flying large, complex aircraft. His instructors noted his exceptional ability to maintain formation discipline and his intuitive understanding of multi-engine flight characteristics. Unlike many cadets who focused exclusively on individual flying skills, Brown demonstrated the leadership qualities and tactical thinking required for bomber operations. Advanced training introduced Brown to the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, the four-engine heavy bomber that would become his primary weapon throughout the war. The B-17 was unlike any aircraft he had previously encountered. Weighing over 30 tons when fully loaded with fuel, bombs, and ammunition, it required a crew of 10 specialists working in perfect coordination to achieve mission success. The aircraft's complexity initially overwhelmed pilots accustomed to simple training aircraft. The cockpit contained hundreds of instruments, controls, and switches that required memorization and instant recognition under combat conditions. 4 separate engine systems demanded constant monitoring and adjustment. Navigation, bombing, and defensive systems required coordination between multiple crew members operating from different positions throughout the aircraft. But Brown recognized that the B-17's complexity concealed capabilities that made it the most effective strategic bombing platform in the world. The aircraft could carry over 4 tons of bombs to targets hundreds of miles from base. Defensive armament included 13 50-caliber machine guns positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire against attacking fighters. Most importantly, the aircraft's rugged construction could withstand battle damage that would destroy other bombers. Brown completed his training in September 1943 and was assigned to the 379th Bombardment Group based at Kimbolton Airfield in England. The group was equipped with B-17G model flying fortresses, the latest variant incorporating improved defensive armament and more powerful engines. Brown's crew consisted of 9 other specialists, each trained in specific skills required for bomber operations. The crew's first combat mission occurred on October 14, 1943, during the second raid on Schweinfurt's ball-bearing factories. The mission became known as Black Thursday due to the devastating losses suffered by American bomber formations. German fighters destroyed 62 B-17s and damaged many others so severely that they never flew again. Brown's aircraft sustained multiple hits, but managed to return to base with 2 engines damaged and several crew members wounded. The Schweinfurt mission revealed the deadly effectiveness of German air defenses and the terrible cost of daylight precision bombing. American bomber crews realized they were engaged in a war of attrition where survival depended as much on luck as skill or courage. Each mission carried the possibility of death or capture, but the strategic importance of destroying German industrial capacity made the risks acceptable to military commanders. Brown participated in 15 bombing missions during the winter of 1943 and 1944, attacking targets throughout occupied Europe. Each mission tested his crew's ability to work together under extreme conditions while maintaining the precision required for effective bombing. German defenses grew stronger and more sophisticated as the Luftwaffe adapted to American tactics and developed new methods for destroying bomber formations. March 6, 1944, dawned clear and cold over the English countryside. Weather forecasters predicted excellent visibility over Germany, perfect conditions for precision bombing of strategic targets. The mission briefing revealed that over 700 B-17s and B-24 Liberators would attack Berlin in the largest daylight raid ever mounted against the German capital. Brown's specific target was a ball-bearing factory in the Erkner district of Berlin. Intelligence reports indicated that the facility produced precision components essential for German aircraft and tank production. Destroying the factory would significantly impact German military capabilities, while demonstrating Allied determination to strike at the heart of the Nazi war machine. The route to Berlin required flying over heavily defended territory, where German fighters and flak guns could attack the bomber formations at multiple points. Weather conditions favored the defenders because clear skies provided unlimited visibility for German gunners and fighter pilots. Most critically, the extreme range meant that escort fighters would have limited fuel for combat over the target area. Brown's B-17, nicknamed Ye Old Pub, took off from Kimbolton at 0730 hours as part of a formation of 24 aircraft from the 379th Bombardment Group. The bomber was loaded with 10 500-pound high-explosive bombs, maximum fuel, and full ammunition for its defensive guns. Total weight exceeded 65,000 pounds, near the aircraft's maximum gross weight. The formation climbed to bombing altitude over the North Sea, reaching 28,000 feet as they crossed into German airspace. German radar operators had been tracking the massive formation since takeoff, providing advance warning to fighter squadrons and anti-aircraft batteries throughout northern Germany. The element of surprise was impossible to achieve against such well-prepared defenses. Initial fighter attacks began over the German coast as Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf 190 fighters climbed to intercept the bomber formations. German pilots had developed sophisticated tactics for attacking American bombers, including head-on attacks that exploited weaknesses in defensive armament and coordinated assaults designed to overwhelm individual aircraft. Brown maintained tight formation discipline as his squadron fought through successive waves of fighter attacks. German pilots concentrated their efforts on aircraft that showed signs of damage or difficulty maintaining formation. Ye Old Pub sustained several hits from fighter attacks, but continued toward the target area with all 4 engines operating normally. Over Brandenburg, approximately 50 miles from Berlin, German flak batteries opened fire with devastating accuracy. The sky filled with black smoke bursts as explosive shells detonated at precisely calculated altitudes. Brown could feel his aircraft shaking from near misses, as fragments rattled against the fuselage and wings. The formation began taking casualties as flak found its mark on several bombers. The bomb run over Berlin required flying straight and level for several minutes, while the bombardier aligned his Norden bomb sight on the target. During this critical phase, evasive action was impossible because any deviation would ruin bombing accuracy. German gunners concentrated their fire on the predictable flight paths, creating walls of explosive shells that no aircraft could penetrate safely. Brown's bombardier released his bombs at precisely the calculated moment, and Ye Old Pub began its turn away from the target area. But German defenses were far from finished with the American formation. Fresh fighter squadrons were climbing to attack the bombers during their withdrawal, and flak batteries continued firing until the aircraft passed beyond their range. The third burst of flak that struck Ye Old Pub caused catastrophic damage that should have resulted in the immediate loss of the aircraft. Explosive fragments severed control cables, punctured fuel tanks, and destroyed critical systems throughout the bomber. The No. 2 engine caught fire and had to be shut down immediately. Hydraulic fluid streamed from severed lines, making flight controls increasingly difficult to operate. The explosive shell had detonated just off the aircraft's right wing, sending hundreds of steel fragments through the bomber's structure like a deadly shotgun blast. The fragments punched through aluminum skin, severed electrical wiring, and destroyed instruments throughout the aircraft. Brown's co-pilot was wounded by metal splinters that shattered the cockpit's side window, filling the cabin with freezing air and making communication difficult. In the radio compartment, the operator was struggling to send distress signals through equipment that had been partially destroyed by flak fragments. Sparks flew from damaged electrical panels as he attempted to maintain contact with other aircraft in the formation. The intercom system was functioning intermittently, making coordination between crew members extremely difficult during the crisis. The tail gunner's position had been completely destroyed by a direct hit that tore away sections of the aircraft's rear fuselage. Sergeant Hugh Eckenrode had been thrown from his position and was unconscious, bleeding from multiple wounds. The waist gunners were attempting to provide first aid while maintaining watch for attacking fighters, but their medical supplies were limited, and conditions were deteriorating rapidly. Brown's crew reported damage throughout the aircraft that made continued flight doubtful. Fuel was streaming from punctured tanks in both wings, creating visible contrails that made the bomber easy to track for pursuing fighters. The hydraulic system that operated landing gear, flaps, and bomb bay doors was completely destroyed, meaning that any attempted landing would have to be executed without normal flight controls. Most critically, the aircraft's oxygen system had been damaged, forcing the crew to share portable bottles while flying at altitude, where oxygen was essential for survival. Brown realized that he would have to descend to lower altitude where his crew could breathe normally, but this would make them even more vulnerable to fighter attacks and anti-aircraft fire from ground positions. As Brown struggled to maintain control of his disintegrating bomber, German fighters moved in for the kill. A lone Messerschmitt Bf 109 piloted by Hauptmann Franz Stigler approached from the starboard side, positioning for a deflection shot that would finish the crippled B-17. Stigler had 27 confirmed victories and was one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced pilots. Destroying Brown's bomber would be routine, but as Stigler closed to firing range, he observed details that gave him pause. The American bomber was so severely damaged that it posed no threat to German forces. Multiple crew members appeared to be wounded or unconscious. The aircraft was losing altitude and would likely crash within minutes, regardless of whether he attacked. Most significantly, the tail gunner's position was destroyed, leaving the aircraft defenseless against attack from behind. Stigler's training and military doctrine demanded that he destroy the enemy bomber immediately. German pilots were under standing orders to attack any Allied aircraft within range, regardless of circumstances. Failure to engage would be considered cowardice or treason, punishable by court-martial and possible execution. Every consideration of duty, training, and military necessity required him to open fire. Instead, Stigler made a decision that would haunt and inspire him for the rest of his life. Rather than attacking the defenseless bomber, he pulled alongside Brown's aircraft and began flying formation with the Americans. Through hand signals and deliberate maneuvering, he indicated that he would escort the B-17 safely out of German airspace rather than destroying it. The gesture shocked Brown and his crew, who could hardly believe that a German fighter pilot was protecting rather than attacking them. Stigler maintained his escort position as other German fighters approached, waving them off and preventing additional attacks on the crippled bomber. His actions violated every military regulation and tactical doctrine, but he had decided that honor demanded mercy rather than destruction. For over 20 minutes, Stigler flew alongside Ye Old Pub as Brown struggled to keep his aircraft airborne. The German pilot guided the bomber away from heavily defended areas and toward the safest route out of German territory. When they reached the North Sea, Stigler saluted the American crew, rolled his fighter inverted, and disappeared back into German airspace. The escort flight was fraught with danger for both aircraft. German anti-aircraft batteries were trained to fire at any aircraft within range, regardless of nationality. Stigler had to position his fighter close enough to the bomber to demonstrate his protective intent, while remaining far enough away to avoid being mistaken for an attacker by nervous American gunners. During the flight, Stigler observed the desperate efforts of Brown's crew to keep their aircraft airborne. He could see crew members moving through the damaged bomber, attempting repairs with limited tools and materials. The sight of wounded men struggling to survive reinforced his conviction that mercy was the appropriate response to their situation. Other German fighters approached during the escort flight, but Stigler waved them off with hand signals and deliberate maneuvering that indicated the American bomber was under his protection. His reputation as an experienced pilot carried weight with younger aviators who might otherwise have attacked the crippled aircraft. Several fighters turned away rather than challenge his authority. The psychological impact of Stigler's escort extended beyond the immediate tactical situation. Brown and his crew realized they were witnessing something unprecedented in their combat experience. Enemy pilots were trained to show no mercy and to destroy Allied aircraft whenever possible. The sight of a German fighter protecting rather than attacking them challenged every assumption they had about their enemies. Communications between the two aircraft were limited to hand signals and deliberate maneuvering, but both pilots understood the gravity of the situation. Stigler was risking his career and possibly his life to protect men who would be considered his enemies under normal circumstances. Brown was accepting assistance from a pilot who represented everything he had been taught to hate and destroy. Brown managed to nurse his crippled bomber across the North Sea and execute an emergency landing at an airfield on the English coast. His crew survived the ordeal, though several required medical treatment for wounds sustained during the mission. When they reported the encounter with the German fighter pilot, intelligence officers initially refused to believe their account. The idea that an enemy pilot would spare a defenseless aircraft seemed impossible, but the crew's testimony was consistent and detailed, and physical evidence supported their claims. Ye Old Pub's damage was so extensive that its survival seemed miraculous. The aircraft never flew again, having sustained structural damage that made repair impossible. Brown and his crew were reassigned to another bomber to continue their tour of duty. Word of the encounter spread throughout the bomber group and eventually reached higher command levels. Intelligence officers analyzed the incident for insights into German pilot behavior and potential propaganda value. Some commanders worried that publicizing the story might encourage German pilots to show mercy, reducing the psychological pressure on enemy forces. Franz Stigler returned to his base knowing that his actions had violated military regulations and potentially endangered his own life. If other German pilots reported his failure to attack the American bomber, he could face court-martial proceedings and severe punishment. But Stigler had made his decision based on principles that transcended military doctrine and national loyalty. Stigler's background had prepared him for this moment of moral choice. Before the war, he had been trained as a commercial pilot with emphasis on safety and protection of passengers. His flying instructor had emphasized that a pilot's highest duty was to preserve life rather than destroy it. These values conflicted with military training that emphasized destroying enemies without regard for circumstances. The encounter remained classified for decades, as both American and German authorities suppressed details that might complicate official narratives about the war. Brown completed his tour of duty and returned to the United States, where he rarely discussed the incident with anyone outside his immediate family. Stigler continued flying for the Luftwaffe until the end of the war, accumulating additional victories while never forgetting his encounter with the American bomber crew. Post-war documentation revealed that Stigler's actions were not unique, though they were extremely rare. Several other instances of aerial chivalry occurred during World War II, usually involving disabled aircraft or crews in distress. These incidents demonstrated that individual conscience could sometimes overcome military indoctrination and national hatred even during the most bitter conflicts in human history. The strategic bombing campaign continued with increasing intensity throughout 1944, as American production provided replacement aircraft and crews faster than German defenses could destroy them. Berlin suffered repeated attacks that devastated the city's industrial capacity and civilian morale. The cumulative effect of sustained bombing contributed significantly to Germany's eventual defeat. Brown's survival allowed him to participate in the final months of the bombing campaign against Germany. He completed his required tour of 25 missions and returned to the United States in June 1944. His experiences over Berlin and the encounter with Franz Stigler remained vivid memories that influenced his perspective on warfare and human nature for the rest of his life. The incident demonstrated that even in the midst of total war, individual acts of mercy and humanity could transcend national boundaries and military doctrine. Stigler's decision to spare Brown's crew represented a triumph of personal conscience over institutional pressure, showing that moral choices remained possible even under extreme circumstances. Decades after the war, Charlie Brown began searching for the German pilot who had saved his life. Using veterans organizations and historical research, he eventually located Franz Stigler living in Canada. The two men met in 1990, beginning a friendship that lasted until both died within months of each other in 2008. The search process took Brown over 40 years and involved correspondence with aviation historians, former Luftwaffe pilots, and veterans organizations throughout Europe and North America. Brown's initial inquiries were met with skepticism because many people found it difficult to believe that a German fighter pilot would have spared an American bomber during the height of World War II. Brown's persistence eventually led him to aviation researchers who specialized in documenting individual combat encounters. These historians had collected testimonies from pilots on both sides of the conflict and maintained detailed records of specific incidents that might otherwise have been lost to history. The breakthrough came when Brown contacted a Canadian aviation magazine that published his account of the encounter. The story reached Franz Stigler, who had emigrated to Canada after the war and was living quietly in British Columbia. Stigler immediately recognized the details of Brown's account and contacted him through the magazine's editors. Their initial telephone conversation lasted for hours, as both men shared memories that had remained vivid for nearly half a century. Stigler confirmed details of the encounter that only the German pilot could have known, including the specific maneuvers he had used to ward off other fighters and the route he had taken to guide the bombers safely out of German airspace. The reunion meeting took place at a hotel in Seattle, Washington, where both men were overwhelmed by the emotional impact of seeing each other again after so many years. Brown expressed his gratitude for Stigler's mercy and his admiration for the moral courage required to defy military orders. Stigler explained that his decision had been influenced by his respect for the courage shown by Brown's crew and his belief that attacking a defenseless aircraft would violate the code of honor that he had learned as a young pilot. Their friendship deepened over the years as they attended aviation reunions, military ceremonies, and speaking engagements where they shared their story with audiences around the world. They discovered that despite fighting on opposite sides of the most destructive war in history, they shared common values about honor, courage, and human dignity. The two men collaborated on books and documentaries that preserved their story for future generations. They emphasized that their encounter demonstrated the possibility for humanity and mercy even in the midst of total warfare. Their message resonated with military audiences who recognized the moral complexity of combat operations. The story of their encounter became a symbol of the possibility for humanity and honor, even in the midst of total warfare. Books, documentaries, and articles examined the incident as an example of how individual conscience could triumph over institutional pressure. Military academies used the story to teach ethics and the importance of moral decision-making under extreme circumstances. Modern air forces continue to study the incident as an example of professional ethics and the limits of military obligation. Rules of engagement now include provisions for protecting disabled aircraft and crews in distress, partly influenced by historical examples like Stigler's encounter with Brown's bomber. The technological evolution of aerial warfare has changed the weapons and speeds involved in combat, but the moral choices faced by individual pilots remain constant. Modern fighter pilots still confront situations where strict adherence to orders might conflict with broader ethical principles. The example set by Franz Stigler continues to influence military thinking about the relationship between duty and conscience. The legacy extends beyond military aviation to civilian life and international relations. The story demonstrates that enemies can recognize each other's humanity even during the most destructive conflicts. Personal relationships can transcend national boundaries and political differences when individuals choose to see beyond official propaganda and military indoctrination. Charlie Brown died November 24, 2008, at age 87 in Miami, Florida. Franz Stigler died March 22, 2008, at age 92 in Surrey, British Columbia. Their deaths within months of each other marked the end of one of World War II's most remarkable stories of humanity, triumphing over hatred and military doctrine. The encounter between Brown and Stigler remains one of the most documented examples of aerial chivalry in military history. Their story has been preserved in books, films, and museum exhibits that ensure future generations will learn about the possibility for mercy and honor, even in the midst of total warfare. The lesson they taught transcends military history to become a testament to the power of individual conscience and human decency. That's how Franz Stigler's decision to spare Charlie Brown's crippled bomber shocked an entire squadron through an act of mercy that transcended national boundaries and military doctrine. The encounter happened through individual conscience overcoming institutional pressure, demonstrating that humanity and honor could survive even in the most destructive conflict in human history.